Hey, this is Mr. View again, and yesterday we started to learn about imperialism. And hey, Madison, do you remember what imperialism was? That's right. It's when one country dominates another country or takes it over. It's kind of like the mother country that owns a colony, right? That's imperialism. If I am an imperialist country, I take over the other countries. And yesterday we found out that was for three different reasons, right? Number one was economic. They wanted to have more money, more markets to sell their goods because they'd forced that colony to buy their stuff. It also meant that they could send a population over there if they were becoming overpopulated. They definitely had new resources that they could steal from that little colony also. Another reason that they wanted to do that was militarily. They wanted new bases, new military bases close to their enemies, or they wanted to take over the countries by them so their enemies couldn't have bases too close to their country. And then finally, they wanted to help the needy. A lot of people would say that they wanted to spread Christianity to these African countries. So they would take them over. They'd also provide medicine and things like that. So there was several different reasons for taking over these other countries or to practice imperialism. And I'm sure that you all remember those. And do you guys remember why they were able to, or how they were able to control these African or China or whatever countries? Yeah, it's because Europe had strong economies, they had strong armies, and they had good governments for the most part. They had superior technology back from that industrial revolution. Remember, we talked about the machine guns coming out and maybe some warships or some great medicine. So if their guys got hurt, they weren't gonna necessarily be out of action for too long. They weren't gonna die. So yesterday I also showed this cartoon, this England octopus or octopi, whatever it is, and with his hands all over these other countries. And that basically meant that England was imperialistic, that they wanted to take over these other countries to make themselves rich, to make themselves stronger militarily, and maybe even to help some people out with spreading Christianity or whatever. But we know that Europe was taken over. And there's a map on 623 of your textbook, but I'm not going to worry about that. Africa, if they just had dirt, the Europeans wouldn't have been over there, right? Just makes sense. They had to have some pretty good stuff. And they did. They had things like gold and ivory, copper, rubber, diamonds. They were wealthy in those types of things, and the Europeans wanted them. So they didn't want to pay for them. They wanted to just take them. Africa also wasn't unified. They were seen as children who needed guidance, kind of like you punks. Just kidding. But when I say that they're not unified, I mean that there were separate tribes throughout these different countries, right? So the tribes didn't necessarily like each other. And so the Europeans would go in there and they'd pit these tribes against the other tribes, and they'd say, hey, you don't like them over there. Go grab them for us. And so the African tribe would go over there, defeat their enemy, take their enemy back to the Europeans and sell them to them. And that was a big deal, right? It wasn't that the Europeans were not going over into the inland of Africa and going to the middle of Africa and grabbing slaves. That wasn't the case. A lot of times they had other tribes do their dirty work for them, and then they gave them stuff, right? They might trade them guns or trade them things that the African groups wanted from the Europeans. So it was a dastardly business, if you will. Here is that map of Africa that I was talking about. And if you see, all those different colors are controlled by different European powers, right? So you got the orange being the British, the green being the French, the brown being the German, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at that whole map, they are basically controlled by other countries. There's two kind of purplish countries, Liberia and then Abyssinia. And those were controlled by themselves. They were independent. That's part of Ethiopia, right? So those were controlling themselves, but everybody else was pretty much controlled by England. They chopped up Africa and took it for themselves and got resources or people or whatever they wanted from these places and spit it out, I guess you could say. They took Africa and did whatever they wanted to them. And in Africa, the borders were redrawn, right? Because if France came in and took over a large chunk of land, it didn't matter if it was at one point a country in Africa. They would just take as much as they wanted, and they would redraw those country borders. Some Africans were brutalized, forced to work, killed, or mutilated, which I have pictures coming up, and it's gross, right? They made the Africans work for them, and the Africans were given no say in law or government. Even though you learned yesterday that some of the European countries were supposedly over there to help the Africans, spread religion, give them medicine, but whatever. They were not necessarily there for that. The number one reason was money, right? And so that they were treating these Africans very, very poorly. And one guy in particular was horrible. His name was King Leopold II in Congo. He takes over this place. He's the king of Belgium, and he was brutal. He controls the Congo, and the Congo had copper, rubber, and ivory. Good stuff, right? And he basically says, you guys meet these quotas, bring me this much stuff, or else. If you don't bring me this stuff within a week, you're going to be in trouble. And people were beaten, mutilated, or killed for not meeting these quotas. There's one book that's called The Heart of Darkness. It's a novel by James Conrad, and it's about this stuff. It's very, very interesting. Leopold went about his business and kept making all this money, getting all these resources for nothing until it came out into the world, right? And some photographers went over there and they did a story, and they showed him pictures of this. And look at this guy. He's looking at something on that porch or whatever you want to say, and those are hands and feet. Yuck, right? And what about these? These are children in the Congo. And if they didn't meet their quotas, or if their parent didn't meet their quotas, their hand was chopped off. So a lot of people were running around with one hand, and in some instances, no hand, or dead. They were killed instead. So when these photographs came out, it was a big deal. The rest of the world were horrified that King Leopold and those people would do this type of stuff to people. And so when this came out, big outrage, and Leopold had to back off a little bit. This guy, if you could see it, he's got hands in his hands. So he's carrying these hands from people who did not meet their quotas, if you will. Did Africans just take this? Absolutely not. Many of them fought back, but they were defeated. Now remember, they didn't have machine guns and stuff like that like the Europeans did. Ethiopia survived, but they had a lot of European technology. Liberia also survived, but Liberians, a lot of them were former slaves brought back to Africa from America. They set up their own little settlement, colony, whatever you want to call it, and they were okay. They were much more educated, much more able to fight back because of their understanding and their knowledge of what was in the real world or the real civilized world at that point. So the Africans did resist, but they were just outgunned, if you will. So after World War I, which we just finished, these colonies thought, hey, we fought for the Europeans, we should get our freedom. But that was not the case, and they were very, very upset about that when they did not receive their freedom for fighting, and sometimes a lot of their people dying for these European countries. And they had kind of been promised their freedom or their independence. So that didn't go well for the Africans, and eventually there's some revolts and things like that, and that leads to some issues. So that's it for today. Check out your assignment. Get that done by noon tomorrow, and I will talk to you soon. Have a great day.